Okay, everybody, we'll get started. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to be here. This is the NAGT and AGI NGSS webinar series. And I'm Susan Sullivan. Also with us here from the organizing team are Ed Robeck and Don McDarris. Today, we're going to be hearing from Ann Ager, and she is going to be talking about how to plan for the changes that next generation science standards are going to be making with the students who are coming to our classes, and how you can reflect that different vision of education in your introductory and general education or science classes. Let's see. We have a little bit of alerts about what's coming up to keep the save that date, and then we'll hear from Ann. So what's coming up is the webinar series is taking a pause during AGU next month in December. We'll be back January 12th with a webinar about teaching for sustainability with NGSS. In December, if FYI, we will be participating in the AGU gift workshop with some programming as part of that. And so maybe we'll see you there or at some of the talks and sessions about NGSS AGU. If you are new to the webinar series, you can sign up for the email list and to get notice of this webinar when it's archived or other archived webinars at the link that's here. And so we'll put that into the chat as soon as Ann gets started. That's what's coming up. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ann. Ann is an associate professor at Central Washington University. She has a joint appointment between geological sciences and science education. And she's the current president. Recently in her education work on teacher preparation and also on teaching at the undergraduate level. So with that, I'd like to thank Ann for being here and turn it over to her.
Thanks, Susan. You dropped out a little bit there, so I'll repeat a few things that I think Susan was talking about. I put up a picture of myself so that you can get some sense of who is talking to you through your screen. And as Susan mentioned, I'm at Central Washington, the current president of NAGT, the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, and I'm co-PI on the Integrate project. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is emerging from that project, and you can find lots more information about that elsewhere. I'm not going to go into it in detail today. But what motivated me to prepare some of this material and put this webinar together is it's really been my work with teaching introductory courses and then developing a brand new introductory course for future teachers with the NGSS in mind. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but I'll show you a little bit more about how I got there and what some of the things that I've learned have been about. So I know a little bit about you from seeing who's registered for this webinar, and I know that some of you have quite a lot of knowledge about the NGSS and about different aspects of what we're going to talk about today, but I want to use this opportunity to introduce you to some of the tools in Adobe Connect as well. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to ask you a question. So you don't have to do this yet. I'm just going to show you where it is. If you look in the upper left of your screen, there's a little person with their hand up and an arrow next to it, and you can drop that down and raise your hand. So you're going to raise your hand if you teach an intro or general education course in earth science, geology, maybe it's called oceanography, whatever. It can be at the college or the high school level. I see lots of hands going up. Some of you might still be looking for where the hand is. It's in the upper left-hand corner. Okay, see a pause. So then I will go to my next question, which is keep your hand up if that course includes already a significant portion of the content is about climate or about sustainability. I see lots of hands going down and still some hands up. Great, thank you. And so then I'll introduce the next tool, which is if you don't teach, you can try out the chat window and type just very briefly in the chat window what you do if you don't teach intro courses. So the chat box is down in the lower right-hand corner, and the rest of you can put your hands down. So I see a few people are typing, Barbara and Ed, Geoscience textbook editor, direct education and outreach programs. Yes, that's Ed, science ed researcher. Great, okay. So we've got a good range of folks here on the phone in teacher professional development. Okay, so hopefully this will be, there will be something of interest in here for all of you. Some of it will be review for some of you, and some of it will be new, I hope. So I have some learning goals for today. The first one is that you will consider the role of your introductory earth science undergraduate courses if you teach them or if you support them in the larger educational landscape, and then be able to describe some strategies for fitting into that landscape maybe a little bit better based on some of the changes that we're seeing. So in order to get there, we'll talk about some guiding documents and compare what's in those guiding documents with what goes on in our classrooms based on what we know from some general ideas, and then talk about some strategies for change. So the first guiding documents I want to talk about are the literacies. And how many of you can raise your hand if you are pretty familiar with these literacy documents? So go ahead and raise your hand if you've seen these before. Okay, so you can put your hands down. These were developed over the last 10 years. I believe climate was the first one to be developed, and these were really emerged out of the scientific communities. And I was involved in the development of the Earth Science Literacy Principles, so that's the one that I'm most familiar with in terms of soliciting input and guidance in multiple at multiple levels from the entire community, and then a smaller group putting that final document together, getting input again. But these represent the scientific community's best attempt at defining what every citizen should know about earth science, about climate, about the oceans, and the last one there is a little harder to read, but that's atmospheric science literacy. And so all of these documents have a similar format, where this is just the first page from the Earth Science Literacy Principles. They consist of a big idea or a fundamental concept, and then each one of those big ideas or fundamental concepts has some sub-ideas that support that, or that all fall into that category. And I included this one in particular because it's not just about the content. All of them include some component of this idea of how we know what we know about the Earth, about climate. In addition to, I think big idea number 2 is Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and there are several supporting ideas around the history. So this is just an example, but it's meant to show that they go beyond sort of just the content knowledge. The next set of guiding documents, I'm guessing, I know from your registration that many of you are at least partially, somewhat familiar with the NGSS, and since this is an NGS seminar, I'm not surprised about that, and the Common Core State Standards. And these, of course, also represent community efforts to put together what every student should know and be able to do at levels throughout their K-12 schooling, within science, within English language arts, and within mathematics. you may or may not be aware that the NGSS were built largely after the work of the literacy principles, so that they incorporate a lot of the content and ideas that were developed in those documents. So an example of what is in the NGSS, here's a high school level performance expectation within Earth and space science, that students should be able to construct an explanation based on evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of these performance expectations is built out of 3 strands: the science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts, and these are interwoven into these skills that students, or performance expectations that students should be able to complete by the end of high school or any given grade band. I won't spend any more time on that because I think most people here have some sense of where that comes from. But what emerges out of all these guiding documents for me is a few key themes. And one is that there's a significant emphasis on human interactions with Earth. And that's both how Earth affects us through hazards and climate, and how we affect Earth through climate, and through sustainability. And there's also a significant emphasis on engaging in the process of science, that we learn by doing the science and engineering practices, and engineering is an important component of this too, which has not been heavily emphasized before. And they emphasize the techniques and tools that earth scientists use, and not just the idea of experimentation or a single scientific method, but all the practices and techniques and tools that earth scientists use. So the literacy documents are meant for every citizen, whether or not you go to college, and of course the NGSS and Common Core are focused on the K-12 students. So how do these matter for us as largely geoscientists in post-secondary education, or what does this mean for us as we think about what goes on in our classrooms? Oh, that color didn't come out very well, sorry. What that says in that blue text is in 2011, almost 104,000 students obtained bachelor's degrees in education. 104,000. And that number there is 4,671. So compare that to 4,600 in the geosciences. So these are probably not unfamiliar ideas to you, but 2 orders of magnitude larger number of students graduate with education degrees. So one thing that this means for us is that we teach a whole lot of future teachers, and I know some of you on this webinar are very familiar with that idea. So many of the students in our classroom are going to be teachers in the future. In addition, millions of high school students will be coming to us having grown up on the NGSS. And of course, that's not going to be a rapid transition. That's not going to be tomorrow. But over the coming years, we will have more and more students who've grown up in this NGSS system. And it's not every state, but it is some big ones like California. And I just got an email this morning that NGSS are up for discussion in New York State in an upcoming meeting. So that will be an interesting discussion as well. So will we be ready for them? So I think of this in 2 directions, both the students that are coming into our classes, who are going to have experienced a different way of learning science and a different set of content and skills, and then the students that we are currently teaching that are going to be in those classrooms developing those students in the future. So what I want to think about is the difference between what we know about now in our introductory courses, or what we know is present to some extent, and this is not from, this is a very coarse way of looking at things, which is the top 12 chapter titles and the top 10 textbooks for introductory courses, which again is a very rudimentary and rough guide, versus the disciplinary core ideas. So here's the top 12 chapter titles. They probably look very familiar to you. They're sort of content areas. And if we look at the disciplinary core ideas in Earth science, I took out the space science set. You can see that there's certainly some connections. Plate tectonics. Oh, where's my arrow? We've got plate tectonics here, plate tectonics here. We've got Earth materials, but here Earth materials is within systems. There's a much bigger emphasis on weather and climate and biogeology. Nothing like that shows up in the first 12 chapter titles. And then again, a big emphasis on Earth and human activity. So in particular, and this is something I learned about in the last few months, in the NGSS, the word sustainability appears only in the Earth and Space Science disciplinary core ideas. So here it is, high school level, sustainability of human societies and the biodiversity that supports them requires responsible management of natural resources. That's within the Earth and Space Science content area, and that those words, especially sustainability, don't show up in the other content areas like life sciences. So the emphasis on, and as I said before, this big emphasis on the connections between Earth and human activity is much greater than in previous standards. And this is true from across the states as well as the National Science Education Standards, which weren't in and of themselves adopted by states, but they informed a lot of those state standards. So, what this means to me is that the burden is on us to address sustainability and to make that part of our study and our curriculum. So let's look at the content. So focusing on this idea of science teachers themselves, the ones that are moving through our introductory courses in our classroom. Let's look at the content preparation that they have. And this is from a 2013 publication out of Horizon Research, the National Survey of Science and Mathematics Education. And the percent of practicing teachers with one or more college courses in the different sciences. So there's elementary. Not surprisingly, most of them have taken life science and a lesser percentage everything else. Middle school, Earth and Space Science gets a little bit stronger. And then high school, we're back down to just 60%, 61% within the Earth and Space Sciences. So we see this. These are the percentages that have taken one or more. The next table I'm going to show you is starting with these two numbers, the middle and high school teachers, and that they've taken one course, and then we'll look at what the courses beyond that they've taken are. So they've taken some introductory Earth or space science, and then if we go to the next level, what they've only about 30% of each of them have taken one or more beyond intro, and these are the topics that they fall into: geology, astronomy, physical geography, etc. And of course, the content in those can vary considerably, but there's still not a strong emphasis in any of those, the way they're that we traditionally think of them, on sustainability or human impacts on the Earth. Sue, I see your comment there. I hadn't realized that either, and it's a little that sustainability is only there was surprising to me, because I think of it as very much a cross-cutting concept, or something that should at least be in the life sciences. So in the intro courses that we have, what do they learn? What insight do we have from textbooks? Again, very rough measure here, but if we look at the top 9 textbooks, these are the publishers of those. And again, this is a really rough estimate here, but I think it's worth mentioning that they have lots of chapters. Most of them have one, a couple have none, no chapters where Earth and human impacts is the main idea, not just volcanoes occur along plate boundaries and they have all of these different properties and, oh yeah, they're hazardous, but more like a fundamental engagement in human impacts. So the title of that chapter is given next here. Most of them are global change, global climate change, but the bolded ones here indicate that they are, in fact, the last chapter in the book. So most of these, 5 of them address human impacts in one chapter and in the very last chapter. And I recognize this is a rough approach to this, but as many of you know, when your course is designed around a textbook, you often don't get to that last chapter unless it becomes a priority. So, yet this is what we expect those future teachers to teach, and this is what students in a few years will be coming into our classes with, that there's a number of these performance expectations, almost a third at the high school level, that are focused on this idea of human sustainability. And you can read some of those and think about whether the students that are coming out of your courses or coming into your courses can do that now, and if that's something that in your course they would be supported in if they already had achieved those learning outcomes, and that was what they thought of as earth science. So, just to summarize, I tried to use the same colors here as the 3 strands of the NGSS. We teach a whole, We teach a whole lot of these disciplinary core ideas. We've got some cross-cutting concepts sprinkled in there and some science and engineering concepts sprinkled in there. And they take these classes that are largely kind of content, disciplinary core ideas, and there's a little bit of science and engineering, and the overlap is, mostly not in earth sciences, or the rest of that. But we expect them to teach, and we expect them to be coming in to our classes eventually with this lovely integrated idea of science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, disciplinary core ideas, and that all of this fits together in a beautiful circular whole. So, how do we do that? How do we get there? And I want to talk a little bit about some new resources, but rather than sort of the specifics of these, I want to focus on eventually some of the strategies that we really used within these that you can then take into lots of different topics, and that's where we'll try to get a little bit more discussion going. So we have lots of new resources from Integrate, and these are curricular materials that address interdisciplinary grand challenges that society is facing, using science and engineering practices, and specifically highlighting geoscientific thinking, or the methods used by earth scientists. They make use of real-world data and real-world issues. They develop student systems thinking, and systems modeling and thinking is a huge component of the NGSS. And they follow best practices in teaching and learning, and that's collected from the research on learning and a lot of the materials in the disciplinary-based educational research. And finally, these are adaptable and they're designed to be adaptable and adoptable by instructors in a variety of settings because they were developed by teams already teaching in a variety of settings. So here's an example. I see John just pasted the link into the chat there if you want to see I think he's got the front page there. If you click on modules and courses, you can get to this page and see some of the materials live. We've got more coming online every day, and we have a couple of authors of a couple of these modules on the line right now. But these make use of strategies that are really well aligned with the NGSS. We developed these with a rubric. That rubric was designed before the NGSS became available, but the rubric was also designed based on the literacies and the best practices in learning that the NGSS emerged out of as well. And in particular, they focus on incorporating ideas about sustainability. So a couple of strategies. And one of the strategies that we use, or that the module authors used within these modules, is to shift the focus from causes to consequences in teaching content. And let me give an example of what that means. So this example comes from a module about mineral resources, humans' dependence on Earth's mineral resources. And you might think of this as the module that would replace or fit in the slot where you teach about the 8 silicate minerals and how silicate minerals form and where they are in the Earth. And here's a different way of framing those same concepts and shifting the focus from causes to consequences. So think about, in this case, an Earth phenomenon. We've got, again, some little differences in my slides here, but that's all right. Scarcity, the phenomenon we want to understand or teach students is this idea of the scarcity or the uneven distribution of mineral resources. So typically, and again, looking at some more common textbooks, we talk about this in terms of the causes, the causes for the scarcity and distribution. Where is petroleum found? How do metallic ores form? What processes concentrate gold and silver? And maybe we get to the consequences, but in the consequences, if you start here in the integrate module with, why does the price of cobalt change so much? What effect does it have on mining and the rest of the economy? How does the distribution and availability of a mineral resource impact how it is valued and used? So you can't do this, you can't talk about consequences without at some point getting to causes, but starting with the consequences. Here's the more specific example from that module, starting with talking about consequences, that in, 1979, the price of cobalt temporarily shot through the roof. There was a supply disruption during the conflict in Zaire, and cobalt was used in batteries, and that price spike led to the development of a whole new generation of batteries that were built on nickel and cadmium, which of course have some other problems as well. But what students do in this module, in addition to looking at some of these data about prices and trying to understand how that fits into the conflict, and use, this is an example, I know it looks a little messy here, from their module, but it's about really using a concept map, or you can think of it as a cycle diagram, to understand how these changes affect other aspects of the system. So, where's my arrow? If the value or the price becomes higher, that might, if it's too high, the consumers or product makers might seek a substitute mineral or product, and that lowers the consumer demand, and that can cause a drop in the value of the price. As that lowers, we've got it increases the supply of the mineral, and students have to work through this concept map. Eventually, you can see that things like mineral reserve and resource are part of this as well, and they have to get to all of the components of the development of that resource in order to understand the entire concept map. So along the way within this module, you have to address why cobalt is found in some places, not others. And you might be thinking that, well, cobalt isn't that important within the scale of things. When I teach about minerals, I want them to know about silicate minerals. But this is really true of all resources, and you still have to make the connection to why is it only in particular places in the world that these minerals are found. Susan asked a question about, I'm wondering about the word consequence. Could it be thought of as relevance? And I think consequence is a particular kind of relevance, that it's, and in this context, hopefully this won't be too far back to go. Yeah. In this context, it's really the thinking about the Earth phenomenon, that what the way we typically teach is the cause of the Earth phenomenon rather than the consequence of that. And in this case, the consequence is that limited distribution, scarcity and uneven distribution of resources has consequences that include social and economic issues that disrupt just this supply and demand kind of the causes. I'm not sure I'm explaining that very well, but I think looking at a second strategy might help explain, because in my mind, there are different ways to be relevant, and thinking about consequences is one of those. If we look at one of the high school performance expectations, that this could really directly addresses this construct an explanation based on evidence for how the availability of natural resources, et cetera, have influenced human activity. So let me go with the second strategy here, and this is another way of thinking about relevance, and that's connecting Earth processes to people. So this is from Sue and Kyle are both on the line, or at least they were a bit ago. And this is from their module about interactions between Earth's surface, water Earth surface, and human activity. So again, if we start with that same kind of diagram, the Earth process that we're thinking about is flowing water. And that was a big component of all of those textbook chapters. So typically we think about Earth results. And again, just taking from a common textbook, Tarbuck and Luchen's, what landforms are created by rivers? How do rivers move sediment? How do rivers change along their lengths? These are the kinds of questions that are addressed in those textbooks. And if we think about the people results, the people results focus more on how do we determine the flood recurrence interval of rivers? What kinds of things can we do to mitigate the effects of flooding? Where is flooding the most common and the most damaging? So in this particular module, students look at flood or just discharge data from the Cedar River and explore how that varies with precipitation, and they're analyzing and plotting and analyzing these data themselves and comparing it to the flood level. This is over a single year. They also look at it over multiple years and calculate flood recurrence intervals. Eventually, they combine this data with looking at FEMA flood hazard maps. Excuse me. And use that information to use that experience looking at one particular river to then develop a brochure for another town along a river where they explore the discharge data for that particular river, also any modifications that have been made to the river to in the case of flooding, and make an informational brochure for the people of that city about what they can expect in terms of the hazard and how they can mitigate the risks that they face due to flooding along that river. And along the way, you still have to talk about the shape and the landforms and the longitudinal profiles of rivers, but it places it in this context that is so much more compelling for people. And one of the things that I think is especially useful about this module is that rivers are everywhere, and we have stream flow data in the U.S. for every little rill and stream you can imagine, and it's very easily adaptable to wherever you are to be able to use the data on your own local river and get students engaged in that way. So again, this connects with one of the high school performance expectations, using a computational representation to illustrate relationships among Earth systems. Even the flood recurrence interval is a computational representation, and that's a useful model for illustrating those relationships among Earth systems. and how they're being modified due to human activity. So depending on the particular river that you're looking at and how heavily modified it has been, that those flood recurrence intervals can have a lot of connection to human modifications. So this is the interactive part of the webinar, and it's your turn. So I want you to think a little bit about how you might use these and other strategies, and then in the chat window, think about how you might, flip a current topic in your intro course to get at consequences or people processes the way I've described, or a different strategy you've used to connect earth science content to societal issues, or a topic or issue you're really struggling with that you would like some strategy suggestions for. So I'm going to shut up for a few minutes, and just let you think and type, and then we'll talk about some of the things that come up. There's some great comments coming in the chat box here. Both Kyle and Susan mentioned volcanic hazards and earthquake hazards, and Sue's here in Washington State with me, and those are easy sells. It's very it's fun and exciting to get students looking at especially the seismic activity day to day, and get them thinking about what would happen if there were a large earthquake anytime soon. So there's great resources for doing that on the Integrate website as well, but it's also something that's very easy to develop yourself. Al's got a comment about oceanography strategies for the topics of marine pollution, overfishing, and sea level rise. And I'll mention one thing, which is not a strategy that's not like what I've been talking about, but which I learned about at a risk and resilience workshop from our colleagues in South Florida. And they talked about how we always, as scientists, talk about sea level rise in terms of millimeters per year or per decade, which means nothing to most people who aren't scientists. But if you start to talk about the horizontal distance, the incursion, the meters or many meters of incursion of sea level, of tides and high tides, that is a different kind of flip that has a really powerful effect on people. So I think these ways that we can make things that are quantitative, make sure that we're using them in a way that has an impact rather than is maybe quite as scientific as we like to think. Susan mentioned, instead of climate system fundamentals, start with resiliency planning related to local climate impacts. And that's a great idea. There's lots of tools now, or lots of data around local climate impacts that's becoming accessible. Student carbon footprint and supply and fuel resources. There's, again, resources for that. We have a couple of new modules on carbon, climate, and energy resources. There's several more that'll be coming out with more about carbon emissions and regulating carbon emissions as well. Local consequences of climate change. So Laura's question there, or comment, that the trick is to find the balance for the non-majors in the course and the handful of geo majors that need solid discipline content as a foundation for future geo courses. And sustainability is not expected for these students. That's a really that's a good comment, and I have my opinions about that. But I think it's a discussion. It can open a discussion within your department, or within, if you have strong connections to other schools where students transfer to or from. It's worthy of that kind of discussion of what do you want your students to be, your majors to be coming out of their intro courses with, and should sustainability be part of your curriculum? You might guess that I think the answer is yes, but I think it's something that should be discussed within your own context. But I think there's another kind of argument to make, which is that it may motivate them even further to deepen their study in earth science and having this kind of inspiration through studying consequences and processes. Kyle says he wishes he could offer two separate classes, and that's always tough when we don't have that much smaller number of majors. It's always challenging. So Barbara, your comment on devising strategies for some topics is more difficult, like formation of the Earth. And when we began the Integrate project, my wish list for modules included basically all the topics that show up in intro courses, and that's things like mountain building and deformation of rocks and formation of the Earth and the Earth's interior. And it is hard to come up with content for that. And we never got proposals from people to address things like, the interior of the Earth or the formation of the Earth. And so not every topic that we have taught in intro courses is as amenable to this kind of flipping or strategy making to connect to sustainability. If any of you have ideas for some of those, please feel free to pass them along. Looks like a lot of interesting climate change modules on various aspects. There are lots and lots of the biggest topics on the Integrate modules are climate and water. And of course, those are interconnected, but we have lots of resources for those. And of course, there are other resources as well. The clean collection is all reviewed activities about climate literacy and energy awareness. Thank you, Susan. She put the link in there. And Sue's comment, although many basic concepts in geology courses can be related to local landscapes and change over time, I think that's a great strategy, and especially when it comes to natural resources, hazards, and water use your local environment. I think many of us do that already, but I think that what's just more exciting now is the availability of data, and then also being able to make those connections to the people issues, the economic and the social issues. And Eric said, I missed Eric's comment there, but he says, for those of us at 2ICs, we need to be sure that the content is similar enough that courses are still transferable. And I think that's, I'm an optimist, although the last few days have challenged me. I see that we have the opportunity to make bigger changes, and I think as high school students do come into our world of higher education with a different background, that they're going to start demanding these changes and not being taught about science content that's too many negatives. They don't want science content courses that aren't relevant to their lives. So I think we can be open to the idea of changing and working at more of a systems level to address those larger changes that are really logistics, and the logistics shouldn't slow us down in getting the students that we want out of our courses. That's my optimistic soapbox for the day. Any other thoughts or comments about strategies, or if I missed anyone there? Trying to focus more on the seismic hazard. And thanks, Steve. This seismic hazard, there are there's a module called Living on the Edge that has a lot more about different seismic hazards associated with plate boundaries. One of the things that's in the works right now, and I know this is emerging out of lots of other areas too, is our materials associated with the seismic hazard of fracking, because of course that gets at the seismic hazards in places that aren't along plate boundaries, which are in some ways at much greater risk because they're far less prepared. They're less used to having to prepare for earthquakes. So I will show, since we have a few minutes left here, I'll just go to, I'm going to actually, I'll show you one more strategy here in a minute, but I think hopefully you share my conviction that we have a critical role in preparing future teachers and all students to address sustainability. And we're not there yet, but you don't have to start from scratch. There are strategies that work, and there are some materials that are ready to go to help you. And those materials can be easily modified for your own classroom and for your own setting, and they were designed with that in mind. I do want to, since we have a couple minutes, I've got some extra slides here about another strategy, and that's really this idea of practicing decision making. And I'll just go through this quickly. This is another module about exploring geoscience methods, but the core of it is really this addressing this problem. To what extent should we build or rebuild coastal communities? So this gets at that sea level rise question, but also storms and hurricanes and development along the coasts, and using climate models as well. So in groups, students select a coastal region, they researched different data types, and not just the scientific data, but the characteristics of the community they selected, how much development is right along the coast, et cetera. And then they write an argument and evidence-based position paper. So for those of you who are really familiar with the NGSS, these are strategies taken directly from the science and engineering practices. They assemble the evidence within this framework of different data sets. Different data sets. They have some initial working hypotheses. They include references to the literature, and then revise those based on those references. And then they reach a decision and articulate the argument. So it's really walking them through using evidence to make an argument and to make decisions based on evidence and the connections between data sets. And so here's the framework for developing that argument. So in the sense that they're practicing making decisions that they will presumably be making in the future. And this is useful to show that all of the resources that we have developed also have rubrics and scoring rubrics so that you don't have to develop those as well. So this is an example of the rubric for a position paper they're developing in this case. Okay, so that's it for me. Thanks for all of your thoughts and inputs. Oh, Russell's got another strategy. Topic is Southwest drought. A list of websites about the California drought. Student pairs select a website and present a lecture to the class on that information. Will grow as I find more sources. That's great. I think asking students to do some research and then present it to each other is an excellent strategy for getting them engaged and for helping them see what are really credible sources and how you can tell. Yes. So the sea level rise question and whether or not to rebuild coastal communities is huge, or continue to build, I should say. Susan or Ed, did you want to say anything else at the end here?
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. That was great. And I'm wondering as we wrap up, you've presented a few strategies for how to do that flip and how to do undergraduate education that's going to be more reflective of the new vision. Has anything been written about the overarching strategies that have happened in Integrate?
That's a great question. I have a paper in review right now at JGE that has these similar strategies presented in it. In terms of all of the strategies, that's something that Kim Castens is working on, and we hope to have that out. We've got a lot of papers to write, but that's definitely one of them that's in the hopper. Yeah, because clearly a good first step is to look through Integrate and see if there are modules that can, that you can either use or adapt for your own content, and then an overarching look at the different themes of strategies, I think, would be useful for taking those first steps. Yeah, I mean, and there's the strategies really, while we had a rubric for designing the materials, these strategies emerged, right? Like it was something that repeatedly came up as a way to do the things that we were hoping to do. So that's what's been nice, is to see that commonalities emerge. Well, great. That's really useful. So for everybody on the call, I want to remind you again about the next webinar that's happening in January, and encourage you to sign up for the discussion list if you're not already on that list. Look for us at AGU. And also let us know if you have things you want to present as part of this webinar series or things you'd like to see. I'd like to highlight what's coming up for one of the other NAGT webinar series with Integrate. There's several more in the fall semester slate, 2 more in November, 1 in December, so that may be something to look at if you're looking for more about these kinds of strategies and materials. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to contact us if you have any comments or questions or things you'd like to see happening on this series. And I thank all of you for being here, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Susan. Thank you. Thank you, Anne.